Okay, thanks everyone for your patience. I'm Rochelle Collins, and I'd like to welcome you to Evening Sessions, which is a twice monthly adult program series featuring a fun and engaging mix of presentations, lectures, workshops, demonstrations, author visits, and performances on topics covering the arts, culture, history, science, and more. Our next evening session on April 17th, excuse me, 21st, sorry, will be at the House of the David Cult. Join founder and director of the House of David Museum, Chris Siriano, to discuss his 2 books and documentary film on the cult House of David. This museum remembers the apocalyptic cult that became more famous for its baseball than religious radicalism, and it was right here in Michigan. You can learn about our BCLS programs by subscribing to our newsletter on our homepage or by asking a librarian the next time you call to request a book. Tonight's program is Copper Miners, Trials and Tribulations in 1913 in Michigan Copper Country, presented by Donna Simons, author of The Copper Empire, which has been chosen as one of Michigan Reads this year. Learn about the 1913 copper mining labor strike in the Upper Peninsula and how it led to a tragedy on Christmas Eve. So I'd like to thank you, everyone, for joining us. And Donna, go ahead and take over.
Well, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Donna Simons, and I'm so honored that you decided to join us tonight, especially when it's such a beautiful evening outside. And I know I enjoyed the day walking around in my neighborhood. So anyway, I'm sure some of you are wondering if I'm from the UP or the Copper Country, and I'm not. So you might also be wondering, how in the world did I get interested in copper mining and the time period of over a century ago? And the answer to that is really simple. It was my grandmother, who was born and raised in Houghton. She passed her love of the Copper Country down to her kids. She had 2 of them. One of them was my dad, and he passed his love of the Copper Country down to his own kids. And while my husband and I don't have kids of our own, we have many nieces and nephews, and some of them have been to the Copper Country with us. And in fact, this presentation is very much a family project. All of my family members have helped me in one way or another. I've been doing these presentations for about 7 years now. And of course, mostly I've done them in person in the library. So this is still relatively new to me. And I have to say, the number one reason why I love doing these presentations is interacting with the audience. And that's because after every presentation, it always happens where some members of the audience will come up to me and tell me how maybe their ancestors were from the Copper Country, maybe even worked in a copper mine, or was part of the Italian Hall tragedy. And I find all of these stories fascinating. So please feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and you can leave a comment or ask a question, and I'll try to get to all of them at the end of the presentation. So because my grandmother was born and raised in Houghton, as a child, I went up to the Copper Country quite a bit during the summer. And to be honest with all of you, as a child, I thought the Copper Country was boring. I didn't like it until I graduated from Wayne State University in 1991. And I took a trip up to the Copper Country with my dad and his family. And for the first time, my eyes were open to the wonders of the Copper Country. I fell in love with the scenery and the history and the people. And at one point, we took a horse and carriage tour in the town of Calumet. And that's where I learned for the first time about the labor strike in 1913, why the men chose to go out on strike, and how it led to a terrible tragedy that took place of all days on Christmas Eve of 1913. And I'm going to talk more about that during the presentation. But after this tour, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, this is so melodramatic. I need to write a book about it. And that's exactly what I did. It took me 20 years to write this book, Copper Empire. It's a work of historical fiction, and it's all about the life of one copper miner, his family, and how they get through the ups and downs of a labor strike and how it all culminated into the terrible tragedy at Italian Hall. Now, these are my grandparents, Richard and Dorothy Seawright. It was my grandmother, Dorothy, who was born and raised in Houghton. And my grandpa Richard was not from the copper country at all. He was from a small town called Manistee on the west side of Michigan. And he had been working as a telegrapher for Western Union when one day the company let him know, hey, we're transferring you to Houghton. And I'm sure at the time he thought, whoa, wait a minute. I don't want to leave my family, friends. I don't want to leave Manistee. But he did leave and he moved to Houghton, and he absolutely fell in love with the area, fell in love with my grandmother, and the two got married. And within a couple of years, they moved to the Detroit area, but it didn't matter where they moved to. Both of them took the love of the copper country with them for the rest of their lives. And again, my grandpa, I don't know what this writing is on the screen. I don't know if it's me just seeing this, so I'm sorry about that. Anyway, my grandpa, not from the copper country at all, he loved it so much, he ended up writing a book of his own called Wild Empire. And while my book focuses on the labor strike of 1913 in the copper country, his book really focuses on the 1840s and 50s copper rush to Michigan. And I love his book. He has several main characters and they go on numerous adventures. One of them is a boat chase that takes them out to Isle Royal. So anyway, typically when I do these presentations in person, I end up selling both of my books, but because we're virtual, things work differently. So anybody who's interested in these books, I'll talk more about it at the end of the presentation. So this is a picture of my dad and myself in Houghton. My dad was a huge inspiration for me writing my book and doing these presentations. In fact, he attended most of the presentations, and he passed away just a few months ago, and it's been really hard on my family. So tonight, I just thank him for, making this presentation happen. So I talked a minute ago about a horse and carriage tour that I took in the copper country and in the town of Calumet. And so when we climbed on board, this was back in 1991, this was my tour guide, cousin Jack Foster. We just called him Jack Foster, but he was a fascinating tour guide. He was actually born and raised in Calumet, and he was the police chief up there for a number of years. When he retired, he became known as the local historian, and his house was filled with mining artifacts, and he was really a fascinating guy. And so after this tour, I ended up becoming friends with him. And usually every summer I would try to go up there to his house and visit with him for a few minutes. And he would talk more about copper mining and the copper miners and the labor strike and Italian Hall. And he knew I was in the process of writing my book. Unfortunately, he passed away over 15, 16 years ago. But I think he'd be really pleased today to know that I was finally able to publish my book. So before I go further into the history of the copper country, I'd like to show you a short 4-minute video. And this video, two of my nephews, Sean and Luke Davidson, did the video. Another nephew, Andy Davidson, put his own original music to the video. And I just think it does a really great job of transporting us back into the time period of 1913 into the copper country. So I'm going to do a stop share and find my presentation. This shouldn't take too long. Let's see here. Okay, I'm almost there. Do a pause. Well, again, that video was put together by three of my nephews, Sean, Luke, and Andy Davidson. I'm forever grateful to them for doing that. And I'm gonna find my presentation and bring that up again. Let's see here. So before I go further, just a few housekeeping items. I'd like to thank Rochelle Collins and the Wirt Library for hosting this presentation tonight. Also, when I've done these presentations, it seems like every once in a while my screen will freeze up for whatever reason. It might be the internet connection. Just hang in there. It only lasts for a few seconds and I'll come right back online. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Michigan Tech Archives for loaning their photos to this presentation. I really think it does a great job of their photos of bringing this presentation to life. So definitely a thank you to the Michigan Tech Archives. So when I talk about the Copper Country tonight, what I'm really referring to are two counties in particular, both Keweenaw and Houghton counties. Now, these two counties combined over 100 years ago had more than 100,000 residents. And of course, many of those residents worked in the copper mining industry in one way or another. But over time, copper mines started to shut down, particularly after World War II. So by 1968, all the copper mines had shut down permanently. So today, these same two counties combined that used to have over 100,000 residents, today have fewer than 40,000 people living up there. Now, the next few photos, for those of you who have vacationed up in the Copper Country before, these might look familiar to you. For instance, this is the Calumet Theater located in the town of Calumet. This theater was built in 1900 using surplus funds from the town's treasury, which is a real testament to the fact that a few of the copper mines did very well financially. That doesn't mean they all did well. Some mines struggled to make it month to month. Other mines had to shut down permanently. They just couldn't make it work. But a few of them did very well. And the town's leadership got together and decided they wanted a central source of entertainment. So they built this magnificent theater. And they were able to recruit celebrities to perform here from all over the country. People such as John Philip Sousa, Lillian Russell, Douglas Fairbanks, just to name a few celebrities. And there's times I wonder to myself, what would it have been like to have sat in one of those seats in 1913 or the early 1900s and watched a performance? And I think it would have been great. Today, they still offer tours. They still have concerts and plays and things like that. Now, this is a picture of the city of Houghton. For those of you who have been there, you know it's a very scenic college town. And it's also a very hilly town to drive around in. While it's great to drive around in during the summer, I cannot imagine what it's like during the winter because a lot of their streets are incredibly steep. And so in this picture, it might be hard to detect, so you'll have to take my word for it. But on this street, I drove to the very top of a very steep residential street. And I got out of my car, took the camera out, pointed it towards Portage Lake. And if you were to drive to the very end of the street and make a right, you would get to Michigan Tech. If you were to make a left, you could go over the Portage Lake Bridge, and that would take you into the town of Hancock. And you can see that in the back of this picture. Anywhere you see all those huge trees, that's the city of Hancock. And at the very top of the tree line, you might be able to detect the Quincy Mine. Now, the Quincy Mine back in the early 1900s, that was one of the biggest copper mines in operation. Today, of course, they no longer mine for copper, but they still offer copper mine tours. And if you ever wanted to get a sense for what copper miners went through on a day-to-day basis over 100 years ago, this is a great tour to go on. They take you on a couple of tram rides, and that eventually puts you into the mine. And you really get a sense for just how dark it was and how damp it was. And they show you different pieces of equipment, such as the one-man drill. So you start to understand that these copper miners put their lives on the line every day that they went to work. Now, this picture is of Copper Harbor, which is in the very northernmost part of the Keweenaw Peninsula. As you can see, it's very scenic, it's peaceful, it's quiet. If you're the type that likes to kick up your feet and read a book on vacation or go hiking or kayaking, this is a great place to visit. And it's also a great place to back up on the historical part of this presentation. I like to start with this man named Douglas Houghton. Now, he was born and raised in New York, and he became a physician and a geologist. So by the time he moved here to Michigan, he became our first state's geologist. And he loved our state of Michigan. In fact, he traveled all over numerous times. And he took a very important trip in 1840 to the Calumet Peninsula. He wanted to gauge just how much copper might be in the region and if it was worth coming back and encouraging people to invest in starting up their own copper mines. Well, he must have liked what he saw, because he came back and wrote up a report and submitted it to the Michigan State Legislature, and they in turn established the first land grant mining office in Copper Harbor in 1843, and that's where the copper rush all began. And I really like this picture because it tells us many things. For example, these copper miners came from all over. And if I was doing this presentation in person, I would ask all of you, which countries do you think they came from? Well, they came from Cornwall, and they came from Germany and Italy. A big one was Finland and Croatia and countries in between. And of course, they came here in the hopes of maybe a better standard of living. I'm sure many of them didn't quite know what they were getting into with the dangers of copper mining, but I give them so much credit for putting their lives on the line, working hard every day just to put food on the table for their families. Now, in this picture, again, we can see a number of things. For instance, all of these miners are probably wearing their thick mining jackets, and they're probably wearing their hobnailed boots, which would have helped them negotiate a very rocky terrain in the copper mine. Now, a couple of them have their lunch pails with them, and this is where I'm going to do a stop share, and I'm going to have my nephew join in here because he's going to show you about the lunch pail and another very important piece of mining equipment. And I'm also going to put this to a normal background so it'll be easier to see what he's doing. Okay, Peter, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello there, I'm Peter, and I am here to talk about the lunch pail and the miner's hat. First, we'll start with the lunch pail. The lunch pail would have been used by a copper miner over 100 years ago. It would have been consisted of two compartments, the upper compartment and the lower compartment. The upper compartment, which would have held the pasty, was filled with meat and vegetables. The lower compartment was hot tea, so that when lunch came around, it didn't, like, the pasty was still hot for eating. Now, the carbine lamp would have been used by a copper miner over 100 years ago. There were two chambers, the upper and lower. The upper chamber would have been held with water, and the lower chamber would have been held with carbon. The water would have trickled downward, and a gas would form out into the shield. And once the flint was struck, it'd create a pinpoint source of light.
Very good. I'll take this with me. Okay, thank you to Peter for that, and he'll join us a little later in the presentation. I'm going to do a share screen again. Let me move forward with that. Okay, so when miners went to work every day, they would enter what's called a shaft house, and they would climb aboard one of these man cars, and it was their only transportation into a mine. Usually a man car had 10 rows of benches, seating 3 men per row. And once all these men climbed on board, the man closest to the bell cord would pull on it. Now, once that bell cord was pulled, these men would have known instantly to keep their heads down, arms at their sides. And as they were being lowered, they would feel a small bump at first, and then they would start hearing the clickety clack of the wheels going over the rails. It was in no way a pleasant ride. In fact, the further down they went into a mine, typically the hotter it got. So for instance, in the Tamarack mine back in 1910, those copper miners were working in conditions of well over 80 degrees. There were many dangers of working in a copper mine. I'm not going to go through all these bullet points. Suffice it to say that a miner, unfortunately, had a 1 in 200 chance of being killed. And it didn't matter if he had 2 weeks experience on the job or 20 years. The biggest danger they faced was, if you look at the second bullet point, it was the hanging wall, and that was the ceiling in the mine. And it was usually secured with timbers, but over time those timbers would rot. And if a mine had the financial resources to put in fresh timber supports, they would do that. But other times they just didn't have the money to do it. So every once in a while, if a miner was in the wrong place at the wrong time, a part of that hanging wall could come crashing down and instantly maim or kill a miner. And so a miner also had a 1 in 3 chance of being hurt seriously enough in a mine to lose time from work. Now, they didn't have sick time back then or workers' compensation. When a miner lost time from work, he lost the opportunity to provide for his family. And mine owners back then are what bosses are today. You know, we have some good bosses today, some not so good. And the same thing back then. Some of the mine owners were decent, and maybe they would have allowed a miner who was injured to continue living in a company house until he could get back on his feet again. Or if, God forbid, a miner were to have been killed in a mine, the mine owner might allow the eldest son to take over his father's job in the mine to keep that family going. So these are company houses, and mine owners had a challenge from the very beginning of copper mining. They had to find a way to attract the hardest working men to want to uproot their families from wherever they were living and move to the UP, to the copper country, where it was known to be almost virtually all wilderness, and not to mention the very harsh winters they get every year. While mine owners had to find a way to make it enticing. And they did it by adopting a paternalistic style. And what I mean by that is they oversaw a lot of different areas in a copper miner's life. It was mine owners who started building the roads and the schools and the bathhouses and these company houses that you see in this picture. Now, we might look at these company houses and think, well, they're plain looking, they're small, they're nothing to get excited about. But if you were a miner back in the early 1900s and you were able to rent one of these company houses, you would have been considered a very fortunate person. And that's because the demand far outweighed the supply. And you can understand that when you know that a copper miner earned about $2.50 a day. Well, he only paid maybe $1 or $2 a month to live in one of these company houses. So he had a lot more disposable income at the end of the month to maybe pay for more food or more supplies, or maybe even put a little bit away for a future retirement. And I think that very rarely happened. So mining companies also supported extracurricular activities such as musical bands and athletics. And at first I was surprised when I did research into that, but it makes sense to me. These mine owners knew what they were doing. They had to find a way to attract these miners and to keep them. And the mine owners knew that the miners were putting their lives on the line every day that they went down into the mine to work. The very least they could do was to offer these extracurricular incentives like bands and athletics, something that the miners could enjoy with their families when they came above ground again. Now, at the bottom of the slide, I put that mine owners supported hospitals, but I'm only going to say partially support. And that's because out of every copper miner's paycheck, a part of that went towards doctors and hospitals, whether or not those services were ever utilized. And now maybe you might be thinking, well, I have to pay my medical premiums too, so that sounds fair to me. But keep in mind that mine owners and top-level mining officials didn't pay a dime for those very same services. So there was definitely a hierarchy to working in a copper mine, and the copper miners themselves were part of the working middle class. So when copper miners were first working in the 1840s and 50s and a few decades after that, they were really paid based on the amount of copper that they pulled to the surface. But over time, once again, mine owners had a challenge on their hands. They had to now compete with the newer copper mines, the open pit mines out in Montana. They had to find a way to scale back labor costs. And they did this by paying copper miners a daily wage instead of paying them based on the amount of copper that they brought up to the surface. Well, this was more advantageous to the mine owner than it was to the miner. So by 1913, these miners were working 10 to 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, and their working conditions were about to become more dangerous. They used to work 2 men to a drill, and that way, if there were any accidents, he usually had a buddy to help him back up to the surface and go get some help. But by 1912, they invented the 1-man drill, and that revolutionized the way these men worked underground. No longer did they have a buddy to work with all day. The miners were now responsible for lifting a 150-pound drill on his own, transport it, work on it all day. And if he had an accident, there wouldn't be anybody around to see him or get him back up to the surface to go get some help. And I'm going to bring Peter over again because this is an excellent example of the 1-man drill and the dangers that followed.
So this man would have been responsible for lifting the 150-pound drill, and he worked on it all day. The drill caused many accidents and deaths. Sadly, it was difficult enough to work on solid ground. But if you look close enough, he's actually standing on a support beam right here. And if he makes one wrong move, he could likely fall to his death. And these were what miners were doing with mining.
Okay, thank you to Peter for that. So copper miners by 1912 had become very discontented with their working conditions. And what they did was to bring in the Western Federation of Miners, which was a union, of course, for miners, and see if the union could help them out. Well, the Western Federation actually had a presence in the UP dating back to the 1890s, and they conducted several labor strikes, and they lost all the labor strikes, and the workers all lost their jobs. So it really is amazing that by 1913, the same union was able to get a membership of over 7,000 men in the copper country. these men were ready to discuss their grievances, and that's what they did. On July 23rd of 1913, they all got together, aired out their grievances, talked about possible solutions. They took a strike vote, it passed, and they immediately went out on strike. And they ended up doing daily picketing demonstrations up and down the streets of the copper country. And what were they striking for? Ultimately, they wanted the Western Federation to be able to bargain out a fair contract for them. But in retrospect, that was never going to happen. Early on, the mine owners banded together and decided amongst themselves that they would never recognize the Western Federation. So unfortunately, the strike was over before it even began. But the copper miners, after that, what they really wanted was what the miners out in Montana already had. They wanted to be able to work 8 hours a day versus 10 to 11 hours a day. They wanted to earn $3 per day, which is what they were getting in Montana, but here in Michigan, they were getting $2.50 a day. Most of all, they wanted somewhat safer working conditions by going back to having 2 men per drill. Unfortunately, this labor strike tore the community in two. Some people sided with the miners, some people sided with the mine owners, and these copper miners did their daily picketing demonstrations, and it didn't matter if it was snowing or if the sun was out or if it was raining or if there was ice, as we could probably see in this picture. They were very dedicated, and they wanted to get the word out to the community that they wanted a fair contract. And they were able to gather sympathy from the community, at least somewhat. And over time, these miners even brought their wives alongside with them to do some picketing with them. And that's what we see in this picture. But there was quite intense fighting going on both sides of the aisle. And eventually the National Guard had to be called up in order to keep some type of peace in this region. And unfortunately, the strike continued week after week and month after month, and the mine owners had had enough of it. And they weren't the only ones. The business owners had enough of it too, because this strike really cut into their local economy. Copper miners no longer had money to spend in general stores or saloons, and company owners didn't like that one bit. So they definitely banded with the mine owners, and they formed their own group called the Citizens Alliance. And they didn't have any formal leadership per se, but they did hold meetings at a place called the Douglas House in Houghton, and they discussed different strategies to get the miners back to work, even if it meant harassing the miners, and those miners did get harassed. And this leads us all up to a tragedy that took place at Italian Hall on Christmas Eve of 1913. By this time, the miners had been out on strike for 6 months. Many of them didn't have enough food to put on their tables. Although the Western Federation was paying out small strike benefits, it still wasn't enough for the miners. Their houses were falling apart from disrepair. Their families were being torn apart because family members were having to move away and find jobs elsewhere. Well, the Women's Auxiliary decided they wanted to put together a Christmas party for the miners and their families, just so that they would have one fun day together after all the months that they had been out on strike. And so they met at this place called Italian Hall. You can see that in this picture. What they did was enter through under the arched entrance that you can see to the left side of the building. They walked up a flight of stairs to the second floor auditorium. And every child was able to unwrap his or her own gift. They were having a great time watching a Christmas play and singing carols and The adults were having a great time too with the food and the drink and the atmosphere, when all of a sudden at 4:30 in the afternoon, somebody shouted fire. And you can imagine what happened seconds later. It was chaos. People fled to the stairwell and they wanted to rush down those stairs just as quickly as they could to flee the building. And unfortunately, with so many people on the stairs at one time, somebody tripped and fell on the stairs, and it caused an instant chain reaction. Bodies started piling up from the floor all the way up to the ceiling, and nobody was going home anytime soon. When the fire department got out there, they couldn't save anybody from that front door. The bodies were too packed very tightly in. And what the firemen had to do was to go to the back of the building, get up to the second floor and start saving people by unraveling them one by one. It would have been a very gruesome scene. And when it was all said and done, 73 people, mostly children, lost their lives in that stairwell, and there never was a fire to begin with. Now this is a very old picture of Italian Hall in the auditorium. And I can imagine, when somebody called out fire, that a lot of chairs and tables were thrown over and food and drinks spilled all over the floor as people tried to flee the building. People all across the country quickly found out what happened here. It made the headlines of newspapers across the country. Now, the town of Calumet, back then it was known as Red Jacket, they weren't prepared for a tragedy of such mass proportions. They had to find a way to store these bodies temporarily. So they created a temporary morgue of all places at Calumet Theater. And that's what this picture is. This is the entrance to Italian Hall, and there were two sets of doors, and the second set of doors closest to the stairs, they pulled inward instead of outward, and some people tend to think that that may have contributed to the tragedy, but I tend to think this tragedy happened because somebody maliciously called out fire, and then somebody unfortunately tripped and fell on the stairs, and that caused the chain reaction. They did hold a funeral procession within a couple of days, and their procession was 2 miles long. That's how many people came from across the UP to support these people in their time of tragedy. And this did effectively end the strike. It's not as though the strike ended the next day, but within a week or so, these miners had had enough. They were just beaten down, and they decided to go back to work for the same pay, the same working conditions. They still had to work on the one-man drill. The only thing they may have gotten out of the strike was the 8-hour workday. So instead of working 10 to 11 hours a day, it was scaled back to 8. But the Michigan State Legislature was already working towards the 8-hour day, so they were going to get that pretty soon anyway. And now, before I talk about my books that I have for sale, again, now is a great time if you have a comment or a question about my presentation or really anything. Now is a great time to put that in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. So this is a picture of Italian Hall. Only the arched entrance remains, and that was due to the age of the building. They took the rest of the building down during the 1980s. And today it's a lot more, thankfully, it's a much more peaceful place to be around. This is an updated photo. They installed this black monument a couple of years ago, and it really is chilling to read this monument. It lists all the names of the victims and their ages. So you really get a sense for the families that were completely wiped out by this tragedy. So really quick about my books, if anybody's interested in purchasing a copy, I can send you a copy of my book, Copper Empire. It's a historical fiction. It's all about the events I talked about tonight. I can send you a copy, a signed copy for $15. That includes shipping. And for anybody interested in my grandfather's book, I can send that for $11 and that includes shipping. And to do that, you would just send me an email at Donna Simons at dksuper@yahoo.com. And I'll try to put that in the chat feature once I get a chance to do that. And now I'd love to take questions from anybody. I'll do a stop share on that.
Okay, Donna, it looks like we have a couple questions already. One
Great.
asked, how dangerous were the carbide lamps?
Good question. I don't see that as the danger. There were so many different dangers that these copper miners faced every day. Lighting a carbide lamp would have been pretty much second nature to them. The biggest dangers they were facing is the hanging wall that I explained. Also, handling dynamite would have been a very dangerous task that they had to do every day. Working on the one-man drill was extremely dangerous. As you could see, these men sometimes were not working on solid ground. They were actually working on platforms, I don't know how many feet in the air. And that would have been one of the biggest dangers they faced.
Someone had asked about were there no windows, but your nephew Peter said that they were on the second floor. Someone else pointed out your nephew did very well.
Oh,
And
thank you. And
yeah,
I'll just type my email address.
someone wants to know how lucrative were the copper mines?
I'm sorry, how lucrative? Well, Michigan's copper mines, that was the biggest source of copper, throughout the country. Back in the early 1900s it was, although they did share competition with the open pit mines out in Montana. The copper mines up in the UP, they were very lucrative back in the early 1900s. Copper mining really didn't start scaling down until after World War II. And then the copper mine shut down completely in 1968.
What were they using the copper for mostly?
For copper wire. And so what they would first do is send the copper to a stamp mill where it was broken up and abraded. Then it would have been sent to a smelter where the copper was melted and casted. Then it would have been shipped to factories where it was made into copper wire or tubing.
I don't have a question, but I thought that was pretty genius about the lunch buckets, putting the tea in the bottom to keep the food warm.
Isn't that great?
Okay, does anybody else have any questions? Was child labor common there?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, many boys had to work in the copper mine when they really should have been in school. They were known as drill boys. And, it was to keep their families going. Yes, copper miners were men. Of course, women didn't work in the copper mines, but unfortunately, plenty of boys had to work in those copper mines to keep the families going. So I think Peter made a comment too. Was that you?
Someone says very interesting. Thank you. I agree.
No.
Thank you. Any other questions, anybody? All right, that looks like it's it.
Well, thank you all so much for joining in tonight. I hope you learned some things from it and found that interesting. I thank you for your time.
All right, thanks everyone. Don't forget, in a couple of weeks, we have another program about the House of David cult here in Michigan. And thanks again, Donna. And I will send you an email tomorrow and let you know all the counts and stuff. I really appreciate you showing up here.
Thank you.
You have a good night. Thank you.